Happy Father's Day. Thank you for joining us for this special celebration of our fathers. The message is entitled, The Model Father. The first Father's Day celebration in the United States occurred 110 years ago, on June 19, 1910, in Washington State. The following year, Jane Addams, an American settlement activist, reformer, social worker, sociologist, public administrator, and author, wrote, "Poor father was left out in the cold. He doesn't get much recognition. It should be a good thing if he had a day that would mean recognition of him." 61 years later, in 1972, President Richard Nixon signed a bill into law making Father's Day a national holiday. Although it is not part of the liturgical calendar, I am happy that we recognize this day and honor our fathers. Sadly, the tendency of sinful mankind is to fight authority, whether it be the authority of God, the authority of man, or the authority of our parents. We want to be free. We want to do everything our way. We want to do our own thing. However, God's fifth commandment, found in the 10 Commandments in the book of Exodus, gives us a word about our responsibility to our parents. It is found in Exodus chapter 20, verse 12. "Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land which the Lord your God is giving you." It is both a command with a promise. Give honor to your parents, and you will be a person whose life will be a quality existence. It is both a command and a promise. Esther Pauline Eppie Lederer, better known by her pen name Ann Landers, was an American advice columnist and eventually a national media celebrity. She began writing the Ask Ann Landers column in 1955 and continued for 47 years, reaching over 90 million people. One Father's Day, she published the following: "When I was 4 years old, my daddy can do anything. When I was 5, my daddy knows a whole lot. When I was 6, my dad is smarter than your dad. When I was 8, my dad doesn't know exactly everything. When I was 10, back in the olden days when my dad grew up, things were so different. When I was 12, oh well, naturally dad doesn't know anything about that. He is too old to remember his childhood. When I was 14, don't pay any attention to my dad. He is so old-fashioned. When I was 21, him? He's hopelessly out of date. When I was 25 years old, Dad knows about it, but then he's been around here so long. When I was 30, maybe we should ask Dad what he thinks. After all, he had a lot of experience. When I was 35 years old, I'm not doing a single thing until I talk to my dad. When I was 40, I wonder how Dad would have handled it. He was so wise. And when I was 50 years old, I'd give anything if Dad were here now so I could talk it out with him. Too bad I didn't appreciate how smart he was. I could have learned a lot from him." Ronald Reagan Jr., the son of former President Ronald Reagan, searched for the model father. He told how the president's father, his grandfather, suffered from alcoholism and was often absent, providing no role modeling for fathering to Ronald Reagan. Reagan Jr. went on to note that as a result of his own difficult background, the president was a person who was difficult to get to know well. Speaking of his father, Ronnie Jr. said he's almost naturally equipped, but he's not the most naturally equipped to be everybody's perfect father. However, he makes up for it in being genuinely kind, understanding, a nice person, and a good friend. Is there an earthly model for fatherhood? Well, the answer is yes and no. There is no such thing as a perfect human father. Some do it better than others, and as a result, that comes easy for them. None of us, however, are perfect. But we do have a biblical model. In Luke chapter 15, verses 11 through 32, Jesus tells a story that is probably the most appreciated story in all of the Bible, the parable of the prodigal son. Many messages have been preached over the years, noting the tendency in some of us to rebel and run away from God's love, entering into a far country, wasting our tremendous inheritance the Lord is giving us in disregard of the price and paying, and the heart of God which is breaking in half on our behalf. The story viewed from this perspective tells us how we can come back to the Lord, our resources exhausted, finding Him loving and wanting us. It's never too late to come home. There's also the perspective of the elder brother, referring to this as Christ's message to mildewed saints. Isn't it easy to be like this cold, calculating, self-righteous character who did things the way they were supposed to be done, scornful to his younger brother's decadent living with a good riddance to bad rubbish attitude? How stunned he was when the young prodigal returned home only to get a banquet prepared in his honor. How resentful you and I can be when we've tried to do everything right, when we discover that God embraces, even on the deathbed, conversions, persons who have wasted their lives. The elder brother puts a mirror up to me, showing me how maybe my motivation for good works isn't out of a love for God and a desire for a relationship with Him, but out of pride, arrogance, and self-protection. Then there's the perspective of the waiting father, standing as a parabolic representation of Almighty God. His perspective probes the divine-human interaction on the way in which God deals with you and me in our wild acts of rebellion and in our cold, cynical, calculated self-righteousness. This morning, let's revisit this parable and see it in a new light, in a new way. And let's see if we can find characteristics of a model father. First of all, the model father teaches tenaciously. Jesus tells this story to Jewish people who knew the Old Testament scriptures and were familiar with the Mosaic law. Basic to this great heritage is the parental responsibility to expose one's children to the teaching of the scriptures, both in perception and in action. Just before entering the Promised Land, Moses reminds the children of Israel. We find this in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength. And these words which I command you today shall be in your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates. Discipline is essential to teaching truth. Moses incorporates these words into his address. Over in chapter 8, verse 5, we read, You should know in your heart that as a man chastens his son, so the Lord your God chastens you. And he warns not only of fathers, but also mothers to live themselves in the authority of God's teachings. As we live under His authority, what we teach our children about the way of God on more extensual revelations and relevance of Him. If I teach them one mode of conduct and live under a different mode myself, they will see the hypocrisy of it all. I must live under the teaching and the discipline of God, even as I endeavor to faithfully teach and discipline my children. The model father teaches tenaciously. Secondly, the model father accepts autonomy. What would be your reaction if one of your children came to you, thumbing his nose at you, demanding that you give him total freedom and his fair share to finances and to finance his rebellion? That's a tough one, isn't it? It was not unusual for a Jewish father in those days to distribute his estate before he died if he wished to retire from the actual management of his business affairs. Under the law, there was a clear delineation of his financial responsibilities. The older son must get 2/3 and the younger son 1/3. There is certain demanding attitude, is there not, on the part of the younger son? He is saying, "Father, life is too short for me to wait for you to die and to retire. I'm going to get it anyway. Give it to me now. I'm bored. I'm hemmed in. I want out." The father could have easily said no. He could have tried to convince him that he would have much more in the long run if he simply waited and stayed at home. He could have played the comparison game, saying, "Why aren't you a good son like your older brother? What are you trying to do, break your mother's heart?" But he didn't, did he? No. This father stands by the teaching and the humble modeling that he and his wife shared from infancy with their 2 boys. He willingly evaluates each of them as they are, as individuals. He knows their strengths and weaknesses. He is prepared to let this young man be an adult. After all, he himself is human. He had a father who raised him. He had his own individual sibling rivalries and his brothers and sisters. He knew the feeling of being compared to his siblings. He knew what it was to want to be his own person, and he knew what it was to rebel. Perhaps at one time he himself was a prodigal son. Or perhaps he had been the elder brother, or some interesting blend of both personalities. I'm sure this father had secret sins and other shortcomings. He wasn't perfect. He was human. To be created human is to have freedom to obey or to disobey. So without preaching a doomsday sermon, the father divides his estate, gives his son what he wants, and bids him farewell. The model father accepts autonomy. Thirdly, the model father concedes consequences. This father had money and servants and easily could have played a manipulative game. He could have signed one of his servants to shadow the rebellious kid, carrying various disguises, going wherever he went, making certain he had no idea he was there, keeping an eye on him, and then reporting back what was going on, letting the father know if things went well or if they went poorly. He could have kept track of all of his associations so that he would not squander his fortune. Father could have said, "I've worked hard for this money, and no son of mine is entitled to waste it." He could have had little anonymous reminders delivered to his son if he began to get in trouble. "Your father wouldn't like this, would he?" Things got really bad. He could have had him brought home thinking his mother and I could never live with ourselves if we knew our son was hanging out with prostitutes or becoming an alcoholic or catching a venereal disease or marrying outside of our faith. At the first sting of homesickness, he could have reminded him of his mother's hot chicken soup and the fact that there is always plenty of work to be done at the home. No, the model father allows consequences. He is not in the business of premature rescue. As much as his heart is breaking and he knows that there is trouble ahead, he lets go. Is this kind of father that we are, the kind of person that we are? Are we willing to faithfully teach and model Jesus Christ? Do we respect the independence of our children and the independence of others as they are coming of age? Are we willing to let them walk away from us, no longer nurtured and controlled, but free to live in a tough, hard world, unprotected? We really don't have much choice, do we? If we don't let them go, they are going to rebel anyway, aren't they? How much better to take the initiative and say, hey, this is your life. I'm willing to cut the strings of control. You are free to be who you choose to be, to do what you choose to do, and live with the consequences of those decisions. Regardless, though, my son, I will always be your dad. With a big hug and perhaps a few tears, we send them off to seek their own fortune, to face whatever the consequences. The model father concedes consequences. Fourthly, the model father loves lastingly. Most of us have a breaking point. We can put up with just so much nonsense. We are patient to a point. We have hope to a point. We are willing to be tolerant to a point. The fact is that we all have the God-given freedom to go our own way and never come back. We cannot force someone to show us honor and respect. At the same time, God has sympathy for the son or daughter who has a parent who gives up on them. Very few experiences could be more devastating than to be disowned by one's parents. We are called to faithfulness, the same faithfulness that is modeled by this father in this story, faithfulness to his child. Just imagine how this plot would change if the father said, okay, this is the way my son wants it, so I'll go along with it. It is dumb and he's making terrible mistakes. However, if he goes his own way, he better never come back here again. I'm done with this ungrateful kid. That's not what the model father did. Instead, we see him faithfully carrying out his fatherly responsibilities. He is not chasing after his prodigal son, but he is daily aware of his breaking heart. It is important to learn how to live with a broken heart. Jesus said, in this world you will have trouble, but take courage, for I have overcome the world. There is a realistic candor in the biblical teachings. We are alerted to the realities of life. None of us are free from trouble. But we are called to continue doing what God has called us to do, while at the same time we are privileged to scan the horizon, just hoping for the reunion with the rebel. We may have caused that rebellion. If so, we need to make amends. Perhaps a phone call or a letter that says, I'm sorry. Forgive me for what I said. I love you. I want a restored relationship with you. Come home. This Father's Day, after day, year after year, scans the horizon, hoping to see his son returning. Luke 15:20 reads, But while he was yet at a distance, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. That father had been watching for him every painful day, praying for him, pouring his heart out for God. The model father loves lastingly. Fifthly, the model father forgives and forgets. What would your reaction be if your child did to you what the prodigal did to that father? The father in this story avoids a vindictive attitude. Instead, love explodes from within him. He has compassion. He runs and embraces and kisses his son. The son gives a speech he has carefully prepared. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. The father does not linger even a minute over this son's acknowledgement of his sinfulness and unworthiness. He is not interested in saying, I told you so. Instead, he is overwhelmed with joy that floods through his system. He can do nothing but rejoice. The model father forgives and forgets. Sixthly, the model father celebrates cheerfully. He doesn't even give his son a chance to ask to be a servant as he had planned to do. He calls for the best robe. In the Hebrew tradition, that robe stands for honor. He calls for a ring. The ring in the Hebrew tradition stands for authority. If a man gave another his signet ring, it was the same as giving him a power of attorney in today's world. He calls for shoes. Shoes were worn as a sign of freedom. The shoes stand for a son as opposed to a slave. He calls for a banquet, a feast to make merry. For this is my son who was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now he was found. Verse 24 of our text. The model father celebrates cheerfully. Finally, the model father accepts ambiguity. Jesus has a very interesting way of bringing to conclusion this story. It ends with the father's response to the elder brother's sneering accusations that there had not been a party for him, but that this no-good brother who had devoured the father's hard-earned money with harlots ends up getting the fatted calf killed in his honor. What is the father's response? He acknowledges the faithfulness of the older brother. He makes no demands for performance on the younger brother. Life goes on. None of us know the future, do we? Being a father, being a mother, being a son or a daughter, that's all of us, has no signed, sealed, and delivered guarantees. The model father accepts this ambiguity as a fact of life and moves on, faithfully doing and being what God called him to be, no matter what the significant others in his life choose to do and be. So what have we learned today? The model father teaches truth tenaciously. The model father accepts autonomy. The model father concedes consequences. The model father loves lastingly. The model father forgives and forgets. The model father celebrates cheerfully. The model father accepts ambiguity. You see, God himself is the model father, and he loves us so much that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. Our beautiful, beautiful, glorious Savior.